Hello again guys, this is Landro off of the Wildhammer EU Server, coming at you today with the Madness of Deathwing encounter, 10-man normal, and this is done by the guild Who Dares Wins, and the fight will be from an Atonement Disc Priest perspective. Now these platforms are all relatively similar. You will lose one of your added buffs per platform. But the mechanics remain the same, it's just how you deal with them that will change. Now this initial platform is relatively straightforward, as we have the buff called Dream, and your tanks will use that to mitigate the damage of Impale. We have run with 2 tanks, so they will switch after the first Impale, and we run with 3 healers and 5 DPS. Now what this means is the fight will go on a little bit longer, but you've got additional healers to cope with the damage, and you've got the second tank to ensure that if a second Impale were to go off, the tank won't get one-shotted. We found this system to work quite well. There are many setups that work equally as well. This provided us with our first kill, which was, of course, prior to any of the nerfs that have happened recently. So we think it works for us, and as a guild we will do this regularly, and we quite often one-shot this boss. Unfortunately we wiped at 0.2% on our first attempt, so it just goes to show how close the encounter is with this setup. The first part of phase 1, of platform 1 I should say, is relatively straightforward. You target the Elementing bolts when they're in the air, you target the corruption when it's up, and then you switch to the arm tentacle. Now the hemorrhage will happen, and those blobs need to be prioritised by your DPS. They need to drop down as soon as possible. The blistering tentacles that spawn on this platform only just give a small buff to damage, so there'll be a little bit more raid healing to be done, and then they will be that you won't have to single target or AoE them down, they will just die. So you focus on the arm tentacle, and from a healing perspective, what you want to be doing on these first 2 platforms is managing your cooldowns, both your healing cooldowns and your mana return cooldowns. You need to keep your rapture rolling, especially as a disc priest, and you use your mana and healing throughput cooldowns to enable you to heal the damage, keep everybody topped up, and using as little mana as you can. So it's prayer of healings, it's prayer of mendings, it's the odd shield to proc your rapture, it's penancing if somebody takes a spike of single target damage, and it's greater heals if somebody takes consistent spikes of damage, which you shouldn't get on the first 2 platforms. This second platform is identical. As you land, you will usually use a Hymn of Hope. Now the reason you do this is you will want this available for your phase 2. You will need to regain your mana when you go into that phase. I use Hymn of Hope as I land, and then 1 minute into the platform I will use my Shadow Fiend. That will enable me to use both simultaneously during phase 2, which will give me yet more mana return. So the mechanics of this platform are identical to the first. The only difference is you haven't got your Dream button to press for the damage mitigation, so the tanks will have to use their own cooldowns to deal with the Impales. Our tanks do a fine job of this, and they will switch when one has had the Impale, and as a healer you're just spot healing anybody who takes a crush and awaiting the next platform. During this stage, all you're doing is minimising the heals you need to do, making sure everybody is spread so that crush hits as few people as possible, and watching your mana. When the Elementing bolt spawns, the DPS will switch to that and kill it whilst it's in the air before it lands, so there's yet more healing avoided then. When the mutated corruption is down, you will switch back to the wing, or the arm tentacle, sorry, at this stage, and you will stack to enable AoE healing to deal with any of the blistering tentacles or cataclysm. It's really easy to keep your rapture rolling at this point. The damage is quite consistent, so as long as you keep your shields and time the shields that you use and the people you use them on well, then it should keep your rapture rolling. I tend to use a shield when my rapture cooldown is on around about 3, sometimes 2 seconds. What that means is rapture will come off cooldown and the next shield will get consumed relatively quickly, so you're keeping your rapture uptime as much as possible. That's the key part here for a disciplined priest. The fight is almost 15 minutes long, so you need to use your cooldowns very effectively to enable yourself to have mana for the hardest bit of the fight, which comes in platforms 3, 4, and then during the phase 2. So you're just your AoEing, your prayer of healing, your prayer of mending, your shielding. You're using your mana reducing cooldowns such as power infusion with the 2 set, of course, that gives you a mana reduction to your spells. your shielding to keep your rapture rolling as much as possible, and as I said before, your spot healing if there is a spike of damage, which doesn't happen on this platform. The next two platforms are slightly different, so I will talk over the mechanics that change there and what you need to think about as a healer there. As I land, obviously I haven't got Hymn of Hope, so I will use a Potion of Concentration in the small downtime you get between landing on the platform and the corruption spawning, and that's quite good mana return. At this stage, it's 22,000 mana return, so it's better than a mythical mana potion, and you've got the time to be able to use it. Now, the first thing I do when I land on this platform is get into my position that I will want the raid to stack at when the Elementium Bolt spawns. So it's around about where I am. The reason the raid will stack on me is because I will use my Powered Barrier, which reduces the damage that the raid take. And the principles are the same. The only difference, the first Impale you will deal with a Pain Suppression, and it gets called out on Vent. Or if you do it often enough, you'll get into the routine of just knowing that you do that. That is to save a tank cooldown for slightly later in the encounter when he might need it, and for during the Elementium Bolt. So you want to keep everybody topped up. If anybody takes a crush, get them back up to health ASAP. Spread your shields around. It's mostly single target healing and preparing for the Elementium Bolt. Now when the Elementium Bolt spawns, the raid will stack under me, under my bubble, and we will be AoE healed to full health when the bolt lands, and then the DPS will move from within the bubble and go and DPS the Elementium Bolt down before it ticks too much, doing too much damage. And that's relatively straightforward. This platform isn't too difficult on that front. Once the corruption is downed, you will repeat what you've done on platforms 1 and 2, which is stack at the wing or arm. In this case it's a wing. Stack for your AoE healing, and you will stack your Evangelism to consume it as an Archangel to increase your Throughput. And I usually do that for the first set of Blistering Tentacles, and then on the second set of Blistering Tentacles I will use my Power Infusion. On the first two platforms you can give your Power Infusion to a DPS. It will aid them more than it will you in those first two platforms. However, it does depend on your raid makeup, your raid composition, and how you feel your mana's doing. As I mentioned before, we wiped at 0.2% in our first attempt. So, and one of the reasons why we wiped was I was for the last 5% of the fight. So I decided to use my Power Infusion on myself this time to ensure that my mana reduction was effective, or the mana reduction of my healing spells was useful come the end of the fight. We didn't have much of a DPS problem. So it was the extra mana reduction was better than the extra healing benefit from Power Infusion. Keep your Rapture rolling over, keep AoE healing the raid, spot heal where necessary, and keep your Prayer of Mending bouncing. And this platform is not that much harder other than the Elementium Bolt than the previous two, and you move then across to platform 4. Now it's worth mentioning at this stage that we actually send a DPS over to this platform during platform 1. One DPS will go over and will do about 5% damage to the wing. And what this means is when you land at this platform, when it's platform 4, it will take very little damage on the wing before the corruption spawns. This is beneficial because of the move Cataclysm. Now this is dependent on a certain amount of DPS, and of course we run with 3 healers, 2 tanks, 5 DPS. So what that means is we won't have, no matter how good your DPS are, you will very unlikely have the DPS that will take the wing or arm down all the way during a normal phase, during the normal Cataclysm phase. So by sending the extra DPS over at the start, it means we've got a head start on this platform. And the principle is the same as the third platform. Spread, spot heal, tanks call for their Impale, and if they need a cooldown it can be used. And when the Elementium Bolt spawns, stack at a location far away from its landing point and use healing and mana and damage mitigation cooldowns. As you can see, my Powered Barrier wasn't actually off cooldown. It's slightly out of sync, but we managed to survive. Okay, the other healers pulled us through here. And that's the one thing that's worth noting about this encounter. No matter how much you pre-plan when the damage comes or when you expect your cooldowns to be ready, there's always a time when, for whatever reason, it might be the luck of the spell weave, it might be a slight increase in DPS, it might be a slight loss of focus somewhere which caused DPS to drop, but your cooldowns won't always be necessarily up when you expect them to be, so you need to adapt as the encounter progresses. Now, the dangerous part of this platform is when the Blistering Tentacles spawn. They have to be single target DPS down, so there is a chance that DPS will have to move out of any bubbles that you place on the floor, or any AoE healing, so they will need spot healing. And there's a chance that Blistering Tentacles might be up for longer than you expected, especially if they're hidden around the back of the wing. So this phase can be quite troublesome. But as long as you manage your healing cooldowns, and as long as the DPS are aware of what's going on, and the Blistering Tentacles are focused down as soon as they're possible, then it shouldn't be too much of an issue. I like to ensure that I've got my Archangel ready for both sets of Blistering Tentacles here. Because of the benefit that it gives to your healing, and because of the extra healing that is required, it's a huge buff, and it means you don't actually, or you won't actually lose a DPS on this phase. If you lose a DPS here, and then you're going to have great difficulty in defeating phase 2 before the AoE heal, the AoE damage that Deathwing does consumes the healer's mana and eats everybody's health. So make sure everybody stays alive. Make sure that you time your cooldowns as best you can, and then when you switch to the fourth platform, which was innately the first platform, you go back to start phase 2. Now phase 2 is a strange phase because it starts off relatively easily. You have Deathwing crash forward onto the platform, and he will be DPS down throughout this phase by your DPS. Now they have to switch to Elementium fragments at times. Now what these are mobs that spawn from the ground, and they will target 3 random people and do a move called Shrapnel. Now those targeted people must use their dream. So as you can see, I get targeted, and when it's just about to be cast, I use my dream to mitigate the damage. Now that's important because later on in this phase, when that happens and there's a raid-wide AoE happening, it will one-shot you. So you need to make sure that you're using your cooldowns effectively and using Dream cooldown effectively. Now 2 Elementium Terrors will spawn, and 1 tank will need to pick up each. It's important that 1 tank picks up each, because the damage they do, or the mechanic of their damage, is they put a stacking debuff on the tank. Now as you can see, Archimedes gets it here, so I have to use Pain Suppression, and that does more and more damage the larger the stacks. I thought we'd keep Archimedes alive here, but as you can see, the damage is huge, and it's almost unhealable when it gets to the end of those mobs. And that's more relevant because of the gear issue we were talking about yesterday with Archimedes. As he gears up, they won't be deaths there, he will survive that damage. So now, as you can notice on my healing UI, gradually the raid damage is increasing, and this happens at 3 incremental points. It happens at 15%, 10% and 5%, and the damage increases each time. Now it's not too bad at 15%, it's manageable at 10% as long as your raid is stacking and people are aware of the Elementium fragment and shrapnel on themselves. At 5% it gets a little bit crazy. As long as you keep people topped up, as long as you keep them as close to maximum health as you can, they shouldn't get one-shotted by shrapnel. Now is a perfect instance here of what happens. Now LC wasn't quite at full health, and then the dream obviously got slightly mistimed, and then it causes a one-shot. So that's how important it is to time your dream in this phase. We ignore the Elementium Terrors when they spawn, and all DPS will focus Deathwing throughout Heroism. Now it gets very close. As you can see, mana is a problem. No matter how well you try and keep your mana, at this point you are getting to your last few heals. As a healer, if you are ending the fight with your last heal using your last bit of mana, you've done everything perfect. That's exactly what the whole point of your mana regen is. You want to gear your mana regen to have enough mana for the duration of such fights as this. We lost a couple of people, we've done a few things wrong, but we had 2 replacement DPS, we had a replacement tank, and I think we've done okay. Now that's the method we do. There, like as I mentioned, there are lots of other methods throughout this encounter. People will sometimes run with 1 tank, 3 DPS. Sometimes they'll run with 1 tank. They will sometimes run with 1 tank, 3 healers, and sometimes they'll run with 1 tank, 2 healers, and use the added DPS to make the phases go faster, so that the healing required is less, and the chance of impales killing your tanks are less because you will receive less impales. It's much for a muchness. We find this method works for us, and we enjoy this method. So that was Who Dares Wins versus Madness of Deathwing on 10-player normal. I hope you enjoyed the hints and tips from a Disc Priest's perspective, and look out for my next few videos. Landro out.